What's the most illegal thing your teacher's ever done? My 8th grade history teacher, Mr. Lockhart, kept a Polaroid camera in his desk drawer, the bottom drawer on the left. We knew because Bethany Calloway opened it one day looking for a stapler and he yelled at her so loudly the principal came down the hallway. After that, the drawer had a small padlock on it. We were 13 years old in 2007, suburban Ohio middle school. Mr. Lockhart was in his early 40s. He had a goatee. He wore the same brown blazer every day. He had pictures of his wife and 3 sons on his desk. Everyone's mom thought he was such a good guy. Mr. Lockhart had a favorite students club. He called it the History Honor Society. It met after school on Thursdays in his classroom. It was supposedly for kids who wanted to learn beyond the curriculum. He handpicked the members. There were always 7 girls, never boys, never more than 7. The girls were always 13 or 14. They were always the quiet ones from troubled homes. I wasn't in the club. I had 2 married parents and a loud personality and braces. I wasn't his type. My best friend Jocelyn was. She'd been picked at the start of 7th grade and she was still in it as an 8th grader. She'd told me about it dozens of times. The cookies he brought, the field trip they took once to a museum, the way he gave them all little gifts on their birthdays, necklaces, bracelets, small things. He'd told them not to tell their parents because their parents would be jealous. Jocelyn started acting strange in October of 8th grade. She stopped sleeping over at my house. She stopped wanting to hang out on weekends. She'd cry for no reason in math class. She'd flinch when adults walked behind her. I asked her once if everything was okay at home. She said yes. I asked if anyone was hurting her. She started crying so hard she had to leave the cafeteria. The next week, she missed 3 days of school. When she came back, she was wearing long sleeves in October even though it was warm. Her hair was greasy. She'd lost weight. At lunch, she sat across from me and didn't eat. I asked her what was wrong. She looked at me with these dead eyes and said, "I can't tell you. He'll know. He always knows." "Who is he?" She shook her head. "I can't." "Jocelyn." "Who?" She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the floor. She looked at the cafeteria doors. Then she leaned in close and whispered, "Bottom drawer, left side, locked. There are pictures in there." She got up and walked away. I sat there for the rest of lunch, unable to move. I went home that night and told my mom. My mom, Jill, is a paralegal. She doesn't get emotional about anything. She listened to me, and then she stood up from the kitchen table and walked to her bedroom and made a phone call. She came back 20 minutes later. "Sweetheart, I need you to do something hard tomorrow." "Can you do something hard?" "Yes. I need you to stay home from school. I'm going to come with you to the police station." The next morning, I went with her. I told them everything. They asked me to draw the layout of Mr. Lockhart's classroom. They asked me about the padlocked drawer. They asked me to remember the names of every girl in the History Honor Society. I remembered all 7. They told me I'd done the right thing. They told me to go home and not say anything to anyone. The next morning at 8:14 a.m., just as Mr. Lockhart was about to start first period, 3 plainclothes detectives walked into his classroom. They asked him to step outside. He said he was teaching a class. They said it wasn't a request. They escorted him out and down the hall and out of the building. They took his desk apart in front of his empty classroom. 28 kids watched. They cut the padlock with bolt cutters. There were Polaroids in the drawer, hundreds of them, going back 14 years. Mr. Lockhart was arrested in the parking lot. He was charged with 37 counts. He pled guilty to 26 of them to avoid trial. He got 43 years. Here's what nobody knew at the time. The detectives I'd spoken to had been investigating Mr. Lockhart for 11 months. They'd had a tip from another mother. They couldn't get a warrant. They needed a child witness willing to testify to what they'd seen or been told directly. They'd been waiting. Jocelyn's whisper to me at lunch was the testimony they needed. I testified at the sentencing. So did Jocelyn. So did 4 other girls. We were all 14 by then. The judge sentenced him to maximum on every count. Mr. Lockhart is still in prison today. But last year I got a letter in the mail from a private investigator in Cleveland named Pete Maxwell. He'd been hired by a woman who didn't want to be named. The letter said, "Mr. Lockhart wasn't working alone. We have evidence of a network operating in 3 states across 14 years. Your testimony in 2007 disrupted but did not dismantle this network. We have reason to believe at least 4 other educators are still active. We need to talk." I called Jocelyn that night. She's 30 now, married, 2 kids. I told her about the letter. She went silent for a long time. Then she said, "I have a letter too. Mine came 8 months ago. I think we need to meet him together." I called Pete the same week. He picked up on the second ring, but he didn't say hello like a normal person. He just said, "Go ahead." I told him who I was. He was careful on the phone. He gave me a date, a time, and a city, and then he said, "Bring nothing digital. No phone recording, no laptop. Leave your phone in your car when you come inside." I asked him why. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "The people we're looking at have connections in school administration across 3 states. 2 of them are still teaching right now, today, with children in their classrooms." That sentence kept me awake for 2 nights straight. The weekend before the meeting, I drove to Jocelyn's house. It was about a 3-hour drive. I hadn't been in the same room with her in 6 years. When she opened the door, she looked healthy. Her hair was long. She'd put on a little weight in a good way. She hugged me, and it felt like being 13 again for just a second. But when we sat down at her kitchen table, I noticed her hands. They were shaking. Not a lot, but I caught it because I'd known her since we were 11, and I knew what her hands looked like when she was scared. She wrapped them around a coffee mug to try to keep them still, but it didn't really work. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, and then Jocelyn looked down at the table and said, "I never stopped thinking about that drawer. I dream about the sound the padlock made when they cut it. Every Thursday I get a knot in my stomach, and I don't even know why until I check the calendar." I reached across the table and put my hand on top of hers and held it there. She told me about her letter from Pete. She'd ignored it for 5 months. She'd shoved it in the back of a junk drawer. She only opened it because her therapist encouraged her to. One afternoon, while her kids were napping, she sat on the bathroom floor and opened the envelope. Inside was a list of dates and school names. 3 of the schools were in Ohio. 1 was in Pennsylvania. 1 was in West Virginia. Next to each school was a name. Next to each name was a number. Jocelyn looked at me and said, "The numbers were counts, like what Mr. Lockhart had. Counts." She swallowed hard. The lowest number on the list was 11. We were still sitting there when the front door opened and her husband Benson walked in with grocery bags. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a real smile. Jocelyn got up after a few minutes to check on the kids in the backyard, and that's when Benson came back into the dining area and sat down across from me. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me and said, "I need you to understand something. Jocelyn spent 4 years in therapy to get to where she is. She has nightmares maybe once a month now instead of every night. If this meeting sets her back, I'm holding you responsible. His voice was calm, but there was something hard underneath it. I got it. He loved her. He'd watched her fight her way back. I said, I understand, but there are kids in classrooms right now with teachers on that list. Benson looked out the window at his own kids running around in the yard. He didn't say anything else. 3 days before the meeting, I got home from work, and there was a certified letter in my mailbox. I had to sign for it. It was a cease and desist letter on behalf of B. McPowell, Mr. Lockhart's wife. The letter said that any participation in an unauthorized investigation into Mr. Lockhart's case constituted harassment and could result in civil action. It listed my full legal name, the name I never use anywhere online, and it listed my current address, not a past address, my apartment, the one I'd been living in for less than 2 years. Someone had given B my information, someone who knew where I lived right now. I called Pete from the front steps. I told him about the letter. He sounded like someone who'd been expecting the call. He said, she sent one to every person I've contacted. She's been tracking my investigation for months. She has a lawyer on retainer. I asked how she even knew about the investigation. Pete was quiet for a second. Then he said, because someone in the network told her. That's how I know the network is real. I leaned against my front door and closed my eyes. The network told her. That meant someone connected to those other 4 men, someone still working, still around kids, had found out about Pete's investigation and had gone to B to help shut it down. This was bigger than one man with a padlocked drawer. I called Jocelyn. She picked up, but she was already crying. Benson had answered the door when the letter was delivered. He'd signed for it. Jocelyn's voice was shaking and thick, and she said, Benson says I can't go to the meeting. He says if B sues us, we could lose the house. He says I need to think about our kids. I closed my eyes. I said, Jocelyn, there are other people's kids sitting in classrooms with these teachers right now. The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing. I could hear one of her kids laughing somewhere in the background. Then Jocelyn whispered, I know, give me a day. I sat on my bathroom floor with the cease and desist letter in my lap. I pulled up an old photo on my phone, me at 14, sitting on a bench outside the courthouse the day Mr. Lockhart was sentenced. My braces were off. I was wearing a blue sweater that was too big for me. My mom was sitting next to me holding my hand. I looked at that girl for a long time. She had just stood up in front of a room full of adults and told them what her best friend had whispered to her at lunch. I owed that girl something. I called Pete. I said, I'll be there. He said, good. Jocelyn called me back the next morning. Her voice sounded different, steady. She said, Benson and I had a fight last night, but I told him something I've never told him before. I told him what the Polaroids looked like. I described them, every single one that was of me, what I was wearing, where I was sitting, the ones from the classroom, the ones from the museum trip. She paused. He threw up in the bathroom. He was in there for 10 minutes. Then he came out and he sat down next to me on the bed and he grabbed both my hands and he said, go to the meeting. I'll watch the kids. I cried so hard I couldn't speak. The meeting was at a hotel conference room that Pete had rented under a fake name. I got there first. Jill came in about 10 minutes later wearing her work clothes. She sat next to me and put her hand on my knee and didn't say anything. Then Pete walked in. He was in his 50s, gray hair. He carried a leather bag that looked like it had been through a war. He shook our hands and sat down across from us and pulled a folder out of his bag and set it flat on the table. He put both hands on it and looked at us and said, I've been doing this for 31 years. This is the worst case I've ever worked. He opened the folder, 5 photographs, headshots. Each one was a middle-aged man. He pointed at each one, a science teacher, a vice principal, a track coach, 2 more from districts I'd never heard of. Pete said each one was connected to Mr. Lockhart through a professional development group that met once a year. They used it as cover. They shared methods. They shared access. They shared victims across state lines. Jocelyn arrived about 20 minutes late. She'd been crying in the parking lot. She sat down next to me. Pete slid the folder across the table to her. Jocelyn opened it and looked at the 5 photographs. She went through them slowly. First one, nothing. Second one, nothing. Third one. She stopped. The color left her face. She put her finger on the 3rd photograph and her voice came out thin and high and she said, I know him. He came to one of the Thursday meetings. Mr. Lockhart introduced him as a colleague. He watched us. The room got very still. Pete picked up a pen. That's the one we can't find. He retired in 2019 and moved. If you can tell me anything else about that visit, it helps. Jocelyn closed her eyes. Then she started talking. She remembered it was fall. She remembered the man was wearing a green polo shirt. She remembered he brought cookies from a bakery, a specific one. She described the box, the color of the ribbon. She remembered he sat in the back of the room the whole time and didn't say anything. He just watched. Pete wrote everything down. That was when the conference room door opened. I didn't hear a knock. The door just opened and a woman walked in and the energy in the room changed so fast it was like someone had flipped a switch. She was in her 60s, gray hair pulled back tight. She was wearing a dark coat and her hands were shaking at her sides, and her face was set in this hard, angry mask that looked like it had been there for years. B. McPowell. I recognized her face from the picture that used to sit on Mr. Lockhart's desk. She pointed at me. You destroyed my family 17 years ago and now you're doing it again. Pete stood up. Jill stood up. B. didn't look at either of them. She walked straight toward me and stopped about 3 feet from where I was sitting and said, my boys grew up without a father because of you. Caleb won't even use his last name anymore. Zion moved across the country. Trey hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. You did this. I didn't move. I didn't look away. I said, your husband did this, not me. B. swung her head toward Pete and pointed at the folder. Hand over your files. All of them. Pete didn't flinch. Ma'am, you're welcome to sit down or you're welcome to leave. Those are your options. B. didn't sit. She turned away from me and locked onto Jocelyn. She took a step toward her and said, and you were always his favorite. He talked about you at dinner. He said you were special. He said you reminded him of me when I was young. Jocelyn's face crumbled. I stepped between B and her. Don't you dare talk to her. Sit down or get out. B. didn't leave. She started talking faster, her words tripping over each other. She said the investigation was a money grab. She said Pete was being paid to make up evidence. She said the other 4 men on Pete's list were innocent. And then she said, I know for a fact that Gerald never shared anything with those men. He kept everything to himself. He told me that himself. He said, everything stays in the drawer, B. Nobody else gets it. The air left the room. Pete slowly sat back down. He picked up his pen. He looked at B and said very quietly, almost gently, Mrs. McPowell, when did your husband tell you that? B blinked. I watched the exact moment she heard her own words play back back in her head. The room went silent, the kind of silent where you can hear the lights buzzing above you. Pete said, "You just told me your husband discussed the contents of that drawer with you, before or after his arrest." Bee's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Pete said, "Because if it was before, that means you knew. And if you knew and you didn't report it, that's a separate conversation." Bee took a step back. She said, "I didn't say that. I didn't mean it like that." But she had said it. Everyone had heard it. Then Bee started crying. Not the angry kind from before. Deep, broken sobs that came from somewhere so far down inside her that her whole body bent under the weight of them. She sat down in the nearest chair without anyone telling her to. She put her face in her hands and her shoulders shook and the room waited. Then she said, in a voice so small I almost couldn't hear it, "I found pictures in our bedroom closet in 2004, 3 years before the arrest. They were in a shoebox behind his winter coats. I recognized one of the girls. She'd been at our house for a barbecue. She was 12. Jill made a sharp little breath next to me. Jocelyn covered her mouth with both hands. Bee kept going. I burned them. I burned every single one. I told myself they weren't real. I told myself I didn't see what I saw. I told myself he was a good father and a good teacher and I was seeing things." She looked up at me. "I could have stopped him 3 years before you did. I had the proof in my hands and I burned it." Pete let that sit. Then he said, "Mrs. McPowell, will you put that in a sworn statement?" Bee stared at him for a long time. The room was so still I could hear the air coming through the vent above us. Then she said, "My sons will never speak to me again." Pete said, "Mrs. McPowell, there are 4 men still teaching children." Bee wiped her face with the back of her hand. She nodded. "Once. Just once." Jocelyn reached across the table and put her hand on Bee's wrist. Bee flinched hard, like she'd been touched by something hot, but she didn't pull away. Jocelyn looked at her and said, "I was 12 in that shoebox too, wasn't I?" Bee nodded. Jocelyn closed her eyes. She squeezed Bee's wrist once, and then let go. Pete slid a blank legal pad across the table. Bee picked up the pen. Pete filed the sworn statements with a federal office the following week. "I don't know what's happened since. I was told the process would be slow. I don't care about speed. I care that the folder is in someone's hands now. Someone with the power to open doors in 3 states. Jocelyn calls me every Sunday now. We don't always talk about the case. Sometimes we talk about her kids or my job or what we're cooking for dinner. But every call ends the same way. One of us says Thursday, and the other says Thursday. It's our way of saying we remember. We remember the drawer. We remember the padlock. We remember being 13 and knowing something was wrong and saying it out loud anyway. I keep the photo from outside the courthouse in my wallet now. The girl with the red eyes and the braces off and her mom's hand around hers. She was 14 in that picture. I'm 31 now. I'm still that girl. I'll always be that girl."